Okay, so I want to talk about what's going on in Germany. Let me, after World War One, and so one of the things that folks forget a lot, and don't I say that a lot? How stuff is forgotten. It is true though. It's kind of amazing uh, uh, what's forgotten or kind of obscured or whatever. So let me remind you of something you may not have known. After World War One, or at the end of World War One, the Allies had not entered Germany. The German government surrendered before Allied armies entered Germany, which is, of course, is very different from World War II because we occupied Germany and we still have a huge presence in Germany to this very day. So this was very significant because it allowed right wingers and fascists in Germany, and Hitler, of course, would reign supreme, to argue that there had been a stab in the back, that there were Germans, especially Jews, Hitler was always eager to scapegoat, had stabbed the German nation in the back, that Germany could have continued to fight the war, that there was no reason that it needed to surrender. And so it's very significant. The German people at the end of World War One, uh, its government surrenders, but there are no foreign troops on German soil. Now this would change briefly after the war, but it allowed Germany. Talk about misremembering. It allowed Hitler to create a very, very different memory of the end of the World War One and why it happened. Hey, by the way, I might say Civil War in these podcasts. If I do, just forgive me. I teach the Civil War too. So anyway, now let's go back to Germany. The German army decided that it needed to learn some lessons after World War One. I'm always very interested when institutions um, try to learn lessons from mistakes or defeats. And the German army, unfortunately, was very successful in learning some lessons after World War One. Now, one of the lessons that the German army learned, but Hitler he also learned, but he decided that it would be okay, is don't fight a two-front war. Because if you look at Germany on the map, you'll see on one side is the Soviet Union, on the other side is France and Great Britain. You could you, I shouldn't have to really spell out the problems with fighting a two-front war. You have to split your army. You have to double your resources. You have two armies coming from different directions. It's not a good situation to be in. Um, so, uh, so the German, that's one of the lessons they learn. But they also learn some tactical lessons that I want to talk about. And I think you can make a good argument that in terms of tactics and in terms of actual battlefield maneuvering, the German army was probably the most skilled army in terms of tactics during World War II. And partially, and by saying this, I'm not going rah rah Germany, all that. I'm not. But just as historians, we have to come to grips with some unpleasant truths. And that is one of the unpleasant truths. Now, their navy sucked, so they didn't have a great navy. We bombed their air force into submission, so the Allies had a much better navy, had much better air force. Um, but when it came just to tactics, the German army was highly skilled. And part of this is because of the lessons that it had learned from World War One. The German army was shrunk after World War One as part of the punishment from the war. And the new commander of the German army was a general by the name of Hans von Seeckt, and I'll write his name when I post this podcast. So he thought that the problem with the German army from in World War I is that it had not been a mobile army, that it had gotten caught into trench warfare, which was not um, uh, a winning formula. So one of the things that he wanted to come up with, one of the things that he wanted to introduce to the German army in terms of doctrine, in terms of thinking about how to fight a war, doctrine, um, that the German army in any future wars it fought, and this is pre-Hitler, this is right after World War II. Hitler hasn't come onto the scene. You just have a brilliant general trying to learn the mistakes and trying to fix them. So number one, you need to have mobility in war. And this is allowed because by 1920, of course, you have tanks, you have jeeps, you have trucks, even though a lot of horses were still used during World War II, even, especially in the Soviet Union. You had motorized vehicles. And that offered Army mobility, which he thought was really key. And when he looked at World War I, he thought one of the problems, there we go, he thought one of the real challenges for the German army was that it lacked mobility. So tanks, big part of this, trucks, motorcycles, all kinds of mobility. Also, that you had to have a logistical system, just getting men, material, food to the army, that this motorization, which was allowed by the new technology, right, with cars or trucks and tanks and et cetera, allowed for a continuous replacement of men and material in the front. So your army could be mobile. The problem with that before is a mobile army had often gotten ahead of its supplies. But now with motorized vehicles, the supply chain, the logistical chain could keep up with the army. Okay, so that's number two, and it's kind of integrated. And the other thing is that the army needed to have some more independence from the civilian world. Now, of the three doctrines that he came up with, this was going to be the one that was going to be constantly violated because Hitler basically ran the army during World War II. But the first two are the ones I want to focus on. He recognized he has insight about the need for mobility, the possibility for mobility because of new technologies of motorized vehicles, and that this new mobility would allow for a different way of fighting and a more effective way of fighting. No one wanted a repeat of what had happened in World War I. No one wanted a repeat of trench warfare, which was a complete nightmare. So what happened is the German army came up with a new Bible doctrine, which was called Combined Arms Leadership in Battle. I'm not going to test you on that, but one of the things I want you to think about is the thinking that goes into war. There is an incredible amount of thinking that goes into war, not only during the war, but before the war. And here we have an instance of the thinking that was going into the German military in the wake of the defeat of the Germans in World War I. So I don't think folks think enough, well, I'm saying think too much, consider enough how important it is to think and outthink your enemy. So he comes up with a new doctrine, and it's all about speed. It's all about mobility. It's all about the speed that's allowed by motorized vehicles, tanks, trucks, and that kind of thing would give a greater chance to surprise the enemy because you can move into a position that enemy didn't expect. And then once you surprise the enemy, you could exploit an opening in the enemy's lines because you have this new mobility. So speed was everything. And again, the speed is predicated on the new technologies that are allowed by mobility. He came up with a doctrine which I think is very, very interesting, and it's something you might want to think about. It's attack alone dictates the law to the enemy. And so what he means by this is that once you attack the enemy will react, and then you have to react to how the enemy reacts, okay? So you can have a game plan, but nothing is going to be decided until the actual clash of arms itself. And at that point, opportunities might present themselves. So he called it the decisive point of the battle, requiring the concentration of all forces. And what he meant by that is that the commander of forces, and I'm talking not about the general now, I'm talking about colonels, majors, those kind of lower ranking officers that are actually in the front leading the troops, that they had to be aware of the decisive point of the battle as it developed, right? It's a very famous maxim that once a battle starts, you throw out all the plans. And that's not exactly true, but it's true to a certain extent because you have to wait to see how the enemy's going to react. And so what happens is when you attack, the enemy's going to make some decisions that are going to hopefully allow you to see some openings that the enemy creates, and that your army can take advantage of these openings with the new mobility that he has. So armies go into battle with an overall plan, an overall scheme, but once the battle starts, the battle's going to take on a life of its own. And the commanders on the spot have to be alert for opportunities that open up as the enemy officers are making decisions. So this is a really interesting way of thinking about war. It's the complete opposite of the kind of the trench warfare that you saw during World War I. It's based on speed. It's based on mobility. It's based on the ability of commanders on the spot to sense opportunities as the battle develops and to exploit those opportunities that you don't really know. You can maybe anticipate, but you can't be for sure that are going to develop once the actual battle itself starts.